My name is Maya Vance, and I'm 26 years old. The engine of my old SUV groans hoarsely against the freezing night in Bend, Oregon. I'm huddled under a thin electric blanket, the only thing keeping me from turning into a block of ice as the outside temperature plunges to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. For the past 4 months, my home has been the desolate corners of Walmart parking lots or rest stops along Highway 97, where I constantly have to move to avoid the prying eyes of the police. Things shouldn't have been this desperate if my older sister wasn't so cold-blooded. A sharp ding echoes through the cabin, the blue light from my phone illuminating my pale, exhausted face. A text from her: "You won't survive this winter, Maya. Come home, get on your knees, and admit to the family that you slandered me about stealing our parents' money. Do that, and I'll withdraw the police report on this car being stolen. Stop being stubborn, little sister." I hurl the phone onto the passenger seat, my chest heaving with fury. She didn't just kick me out. She secretly sent red flag emails to every single landlord I applied to. She turned me into a dangerous and unstable person in the eyes of society, just to force me back into her hollow shell of a life. But she's wrong. The truth can't be buried under cheap lies forever. Before we dive into my plan to expose the true face of my sadistic sister, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Thrilling stories and life lessons like this are updated daily. Now let's see the chilling secret I discovered hidden deep within our family's cloud account. The silence following our parents' funeral was more deafening than the ceremony itself, especially inside the walls of our high-end West Hills apartment. While I was still struggling to process the grief of losing both mom and dad in a sudden accident, my older sister Gia Vance was already busy meeting with lawyers. Before the flowers on their graves had even wilted, she had successfully filed to become the temporary executor of the estate. I remember her sitting at Dad's mahogany desk looking through stacks of legal documents with a chilling focus that I had never seen before. She didn't look like a grieving daughter. She looked like a CEO conducting a hostile takeover. "Until the probate court finalizes everything, I am legally responsible for every cent," Gia stated, her voice devoid of any warmth as she slid a glass of water across the table. That was the moment my life became a calculated prison. She immediately froze our joint accounts, claiming it was a necessary step to protect the inheritance from unnecessary expenditures. Suddenly, the girl who used to share her snacks with me was now auditing my every move. I was 26 years old, an experienced freelance video editor, yet I found myself having to ask for permission just to buy a gallon of milk. The psychological walls closed in quickly. Gia knew I had nowhere to go, so she offered me a deal that felt more like an ultimatum. She managed a boutique art gallery downtown and decided that I would become her personal assistant, social media manager, and video editor, all for the grand salary of $0. "It's not slavery, Maya," she whispered when I protested, her eyes narrowing behind her designer glasses. "Think of it as contributing to the household. You get to keep living in this beautiful apartment, eating premium food, and staying safe. Most people your age are struggling to pay rent. Consider this a blessing." For 6 months, I worked 14-hour days. I edited high-end promotional reels for her gallery and managed her demanding clients, all while Gia paraded around the city as the grieving but successful socialite. Behind closed doors, she treated me like a ghost. I spent my nights in the small guest room, hidden away, whenever she hosted her extravagant dinner parties. She made sure I felt invisible, ensuring that everyone believed I was just a troubled younger sister who needed her constant supervision and charity to survive. However, Gia made one fatal mistake: she underestimated my resolve. Even though she controlled the family accounts, she didn't realize I had a secret PayPal account from a few old international clients. I spent every spare minute late at night when the apartment was silent, taking on tiny editing gigs for half price just to build a small pile of cash. Every dollar was a brick in the wall of my eventual escape. I knew Gia was intentionally dragging out the probate process, filing useless motions to keep herself in control of the apartment as long as possible. She wanted to keep me in that iron cage forever, serving her ambitions while she drained our parents' legacy. One rainy Tuesday morning, while Gia was at the gallery, I sat in a local coffee shop with my laptop. My heart hammered against my ribs as I filled out my first independent rental application for a tiny 40-year-old studio apartment on the outskirts of Bend. It was a far cry from West Hills, but it represented something Gia couldn't touch. I hit the submit button, feeling a rush of adrenaline that was both terrifying and liberating. I didn't need a mansion. I just needed a door that I could lock from the inside. Optimism is a fragile thing, especially when it is met with a succession of cold, silent rejections. Over the following 2 weeks, that initial rush of adrenaline I felt after hitting the submit button began to curdle into a sickening sense of dread. I had applied to 4 different properties across Bend, ranging from modest studio apartments to shared basement suites that most people would find depressing. On paper, I was the ideal tenant. My credit score was nearly perfect. I had a significant amount of savings in my private account, and my freelance income was stable enough to cover triple the rent. Yet every single application was met with a swift, unexplained no. Some property managers didn't even bother to call, sending automated emails that felt like a slap in the face, while others simply stopped answering my follow-up messages altogether. I couldn't understand the pattern until I sat down in the cramped wood-paneled office of a man named Mr. Arthur Henderson. He was an old-school landlord who managed a small brick complex near the river, and he was the only person who had agreed to meet me in person after reviewing my documents. Mr. Henderson looked at my bank statements through thick spectacles, nodding slowly, his expression a mix of confusion and genuine pity. I leaned forward, my hands trembling slightly on my lap, hoping that this 5th attempt would finally be the one that granted me a key to my own life. Ms. Vance, your financial profile is impeccable. Mr. Arthur Henderson began sighing as he set my folder down on his cluttered desk. He hesitated for a long moment, tapping a rhythmic beat against a stained coffee mug before looking me directly in the eyes. Usually I don't do this. Privacy laws being what they are, I should just tell you the unit is filled and send you on your way. But I knew your father, he was a good man who did business at my brother's firm, and something about this whole situation just doesn't sit right with me. My heart skipped a beat at the mention of my father, but it was his next move that made my blood run cold. He turned his computer monitor around, revealing an email from an address I didn't recognize, though the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. It was formatted with a professional legal header, identifying the sender as the legal guardian and estate executor for the Vance family. The message claimed to be a courtesy warning to local property owners, stating that while I appeared financially sound, I had a documented history of severe property destruction and unpredictable violent outbursts stemming from a deteriorating mental condition. It advised that any lease agreement would be a significant liability risk for the landlord. I stared at the screen, the words blurring as a wave of nausea hit me. Gia had used her temporary legal status to craft a sophisticated character assassination. She hadn't just made a phone call, she had created a digital paper trail that branded me as a dangerous pariah. My mind raced, trying to figure out how she even knew which buildings I was visiting, until the realization struck me like a physical blow. Every time I saved a PDF of a lease agreement or searched for a property address on my laptop, it was automatically syncing to our shared family cloud account. My older sister had been sitting in our living room watching my every move, in real time, waiting for me to find a spark of hope so she could personally extinguish it. "I'm so sorry, Maya," Mr. Henderson said softly, pulling the monitor back toward him. "In this market, no one takes a chance on a liability. If this email is a lie, you need to handle it, because as of right now, you are effectively blacklisted from every reputable rental agency in this county." I walked out of his office into the blinding Oregon sunlight, feeling a level of terror that surpassed anything I had felt after my parents' death. Gia didn't just want me to come home and serve her, she wanted to erase my standing in the world. She was systematically dismantling my identity, ensuring that I would have no choice but to crawl back to her or face total homelessness. To her, I wasn't a sister or a human being with rights. I was a piece of family property that she refused to let go, and she was willing to burn my entire future to prove it. The fluorescent lights of the Deschutes Public Library hummed with a clinical indifference that matched my frozen state of mind. I sat in a secluded corner of the reference section, my fingers hovering over the trackpad of my laptop, which was now tethered to the library's public Wi-Fi. After the devastating revelation in Mr. Henderson's office, the initial paralyzing fear had slowly transmuted into a cold, sharp-edged clarity. If Gia was using technology to stalk my movements and sabotage my future, then technology would be the very weapon I used to dismantle her facade. She had always looked down on my career as a freelance video editor, dismissing it as playing with clips. But she had forgotten that my job required a deep understanding of digital file structures, metadata, and cloud synchronization. I navigated to our family's shared cloud login page, my heart thumping a jagged rhythm against my ribs. During the months I lived under her roof as a silent servant, I had set up the automated backup systems for the entire household. Gia, in her arrogance, had never bothered to change the master administrative password after she kicked me out. She likely assumed I was too broken and preoccupied with survival to ever think about digital retaliation. With a final shaky breath, I entered the credentials. The screen flickered for a second before the dashboard opened, granting me full access to the digital nervous system of the Vance estate. At first glance, everything looked normal: folders filled with estate tax documents, gallery inventories, and photos of our parents. But as I dug deeper into the miscellaneous archives, I found a subfolder that had been created only 3 months ago. It was titled Tenant References. Clicking on it felt like stepping into a cold, dark room. Inside, Gia had meticulously organized a gallery of my failures. There were spreadsheets listing every apartment complex I had visited, the names of the property managers, and the dates I had submitted my applications. It was a digital hit list. The most damning evidence, however, lay within a folder labeled Correspondence Drafts. I opened the first document and felt a surge of pure, unfiltered bile rise in my throat. It was the template for the email Mr. Henderson had shown me, but there were dozens of variations tailored for different scenarios. One draft portrayed me as a recovering addict who frequently brought dangerous associates into my living space. Another version, destined for a high-end complex downtown, claimed I was currently under investigation for embezzlement from our family business. Gia hadn't just been sending warnings. She had been crafting a diverse portfolio of lies to ensure that no matter what kind of background check a landlord performed, I would come up as a catastrophic risk. My professional instincts kicked in. I didn't just need the content of the emails, I needed the forensic proof that they originated from her device. I navigated to the account's security logs and began exporting the IP address history. There, it was a clear, undeniable record of logins originating from our West Hills apartment at the exact times these emails were dispatched. Every malicious strike left a digital fingerprint. I worked with a feverish intensity, my eyes stinging from the glare of the monitor as I initiated a bulk download of the entire folder. I pulled a small, rugged external hard drive from my backpack and plugged it in. The progress bar crawled forward, each percentage point representing a shred of my stolen dignity being reclaimed. I watched the files transfer, the spreadsheets, the drafted slanders, the time-stamped logs of her stalking my GPS location through the shared cloud link. Gia thought she was playing a game of chess with a pawn, but she hadn't realized I was recording every illegal move she made. When the transfer complete notification finally popped up, I felt a grim sense of satisfaction. For months, she had held the power of the temporary executor over my head like a guillotine. Now I held a digital bomb that could blow her entire world apart. I safely ejected the drive, tucked it into the deepest pocket of my bag, and walked out into the cool afternoon air, finally possessing the ammunition I needed to fight back. The triumph I felt leaving the library was short-lived, evaporating into the thin, freezing air of Central Oregon as the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks of the Cascades. By 2 a.m., the temperature had dropped so low that the condensation from my breath formed a delicate layer of frost on the interior of the SUV's windshield. I was parked in the shadows of a quiet rest area off Highway 97, trying to catch a few hours of fitful sleep when the world suddenly exploded into a rhythmic strobe of red and blue light. The piercing flash of a police cruiser's overheads reflected off every icy surface, blinding me as I scrambled to sit upright, my heart hammering like a trapped bird against my ribs. A heavy knock on the driver's side window sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through my system. I rolled down the glass just enough to see a stern-faced officer, his breath visible in the frigid air. "License and registration, please," he commanded, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark cabin. As I handed over my documents, I noticed a second officer, whom I later identified as Officer Miller, circling the vehicle with a professional, cautious gaze. The silence that followed was unbearable, broken only by the crackle of their radios and the distant hum of a passing semi-truck. "Step out of the vehicle, Ms. Vance," Officer Miller said, his tone shifting from routine to somber. I stepped into the biting wind, my boots crunching on the fresh powder. He explained that a report had been filed by the temporary executor of my parents' estate, claiming that the vehicle was being used without authorization and that the occupant was in the midst of a mental health crisis with high risks of self-harm. My stomach did a slow, agonizing flip. Gia hadn't just reported the car, she had weaponized the legal system to stage a welfare check that stripped me of my only remaining sanctuary. Because the SUV was technically part of an unprobated estate, and there was a formal dispute regarding its usage, the officers informed me that they were legally obligated to impound the vehicle until the court could clarify the situation. I stood there paralyzed by a mix of fury and disbelief as a tow truck materialized from the darkness like a predatory shadow. I watched as the steel hooks were fastened to the undercarriage of the only roof I had left. Officer Miller, sensing my desperation, allowed me to grab a single backpack filled with my laptop, the hard drive from the library, and a few changes of clothes. "I'm sorry, but we have to follow the protocol for disputed property," he muttered, though his eyes showed a hint of doubt as he looked at my calm, albeit devastated expression. As the tow truck roared to life and hauled my life away into the snowy abyss, the isolation of the Oregon wilderness felt absolute. I was standing on the side of a deserted highway, surrounded by nothing but towering pines and the suffocating silence of a winter night. Just as the taillights of the police cruiser disappeared, my phone vibrated in my pocket. A new message from Gia lit up the screen, its glow mocking me in the darkness. "How does freedom taste now, Maya? It's cold out there, isn't it? Since you clearly can't take care of yourself, maybe this will remind you who actually holds the keys to your life. Oh, and happy early birthday, little sister. I hope the snow is as comfortable as your bedroom back home." The sheer calculated malice of her words should have broken me. She had timed this strike to ensure I was at my most vulnerable, homeless, stranded, and stripped of my dignity just days before my 26th birthday. But as I gripped the straps of my backpack, feeling the weight of the external drive containing her digital secrets, the cold didn't feel as biting anymore. Gia thought she had finally cornered me, but she had actually done the one thing she should have feared most. She had left me with absolutely nothing left to lose. I began the long, quiet walk toward the faint lights of a distant gas station, my mind already pivoting from survival to the total and absolute destruction of my sister's empire. The morning sun offered no warmth as it filtered through the grime-streaked window of a $10 a night motel on the edge of town. I was sitting on the edge of a sagging mattress staring blankly at the small external hard drive I had rescued from my SUV when a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the cramped room. My first instinct was to hide. I assumed Gia had sent the police again to finish me off. But when I opened the door, I wasn't met with a uniform. Instead, a man in a charcoal gray overcoat stood there holding a leather briefcase and an expression of grim professionalism. "Ms. Maya Vance. My name is Robert Sterling," he said, handing me a business card that identified him as a senior partner at a prominent Seattle law firm. "I represent your uncle, Silas Vance. He's been looking for you for a very long time." The mention of Uncle Silas felt like a voice from a different life. He was the black sheep of the family who had vanished after a bitter falling out with my father years ago. As Robert Sterling stepped into the room, he wasted no time addressing the confusion written across my face. He explained that Silas had never truly detached himself. He had been watching the probate proceedings from the shadows, deeply suspicious of how quickly Gia Vance had seized control of the estate. "Your uncle wanted to step in the moment you were kicked out." Robert Sterling explained, his voice low and steady. But he knew that in a court of law, Gia held the temporary legal advantage. If he moved too early without undeniable proof of her misconduct, she would have used the estate's funds to bury him in litigation. He hired a private investigation firm to track her movements and your communications for months. He needed the smoking gun, Maya. And we finally found it. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick, notarized folder. My breath hitched as he slid a document across the chipped wooden table. It was the original copy of my parents' final will and testament, dated just 6 months before the accident. I realized then the depth of the betrayal. Gia had not. She had submitted a decade-old draft to the probate court, a version written when I was still a teenager, and Gia was the sole beneficiary. She had intentionally suppressed this updated version, which explicitly stated that the West Hills apartment and 70% of the liquid assets were to be inherited solely by me, to ensure I had the resources to pursue my creative career. "She didn't just lie to you, Maya," Sterling said, his eyes hardening. "She committed felony estate fraud. She knew this document existed because she was the one who hid it in our father's private safe before the executors could arrive." He then produced a second set of documents, a comprehensive report from the private investigators. It contained time-stamped photographs of Gia meeting with a consultant to draft those malicious emails, along with recorded statements from a disgruntled former employee at her gallery who had witnessed her accessing my private accounts. Silas had provided me with more than just a lawyer. He had handed me a tactical map for Gia's total destruction. Robert Sterling explained that Silas had been waiting for the moment Gia crossed the line into criminal harassment. The impounding of the car was the final piece of the puzzle. It proved malicious intent and abuse of process, which would allow us to file an emergency motion to strip her of her executor status immediately. I looked at the files, then at the hard drive containing the IP logs I had gathered myself. For months, I had felt like a ghost haunting my own life, invisible and powerless against my sister's calculated cruelty. But Silas hadn't abandoned me. He had been building a fortress while I was fighting in the trenches. "Uncle Silas wants you to know that the cage is open, Maya," the lawyer said softly. "We have enough to not only take back your home, but to ensure Gia Vance never holds a position of power over another human being again. The question is, are you ready to finish this?" I stood up, the exhaustion that had plagued me for weeks, suddenly replaced by a cold, searing resolve. I wasn't just ready. I was prepared to watch her entire world crumble. The oak-paneled walls of the Deschutes County Courthouse felt imposing, but for the first time in months, they didn't feel like a prison. Standing beside Robert Sterling in the emergency probate hearing, I watched as the digital clock on the wall ticked toward the moment of reckoning. Across the aisle, Gia Vance sat with her head held high, wearing a mask of indignant arrogance that she had perfected over a lifetime. She likely expected another routine session where she could play the victim, but her expression shattered the moment Sterling submitted the forensic evidence from the cloud archive and the original hidden will into the record. The evidence is irrefutable, Your Honor. Robert Sterling declared, his voice echoing with a calm authority that silenced the room. He presented the time-stamped IP logs showing Gia's systematic harassment and the verified document she had intentionally suppressed to steal my inheritance. Judge Miller, a man known for his zero-tolerance policy toward fiduciary fraud, spent an hour reviewing the files in a heavy, suffocating silence. When he finally looked up, his gaze was fixed solely on Gia, and it was cold enough to freeze the room. Gia Vance, you have not only violated your oath as a temporary executor, but have engaged in a calculated campaign of character assassination against your own flesh and blood. Judge Miller stated, his gavel hovering like a guillotine. The ruling was swift and devastating. The court immediately revoked Gia's status as executor, invalidated the outdated will she had submitted, and recognized me as the sole legal owner of the West Hills apartment and the primary beneficiary of the Vance estate. Furthermore, the judge referred the case to the district attorney for criminal investigation into estate fraud and perjury. The climax of my liberation didn't happen in that courtroom, however. It happened 3 hours later at the front door of our family home. I arrived with 2 sheriff's deputies and a formal eviction order. Gia was in the foyer, frantically throwing her designer clothes into suitcases, her composed facade replaced by a frantic, jagged rage. "You think you've won?" she shrieked, her voice cracking as a deputy placed a firm hand on her arm, guiding her toward the exit. "You're nothing without this family. You'll fail the moment I'm not here to manage you." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply stood my ground as she was escorted down the hallway she had once ruled with an iron fist. As the door clicked shut behind her, the silence that followed wasn't lonely, it was clean. For the first time, the air in the apartment didn't feel heavy with her expectations or her lies. I walked to the balcony, looking out at the Bend skyline, finally understanding that the cage Gia had built was only as strong as my willingness to believe I belonged in it. This journey through the shadows of betrayal taught me 3 fundamental truths that I will carry forever. First, financial and legal independence isn't just a goal, it is a vital shield. Never allow anyone, regardless of their title, to hold total control over your identity or your assets without oversight. Second, blood might be thicker than water, but it is never a valid excuse for abuse. A family member who demands your total submission in exchange for safety is a captor, not a protector. Finally, in our modern world, your digital footprint is your reputation. Learning to protect my data and audit my own digital presence was what ultimately gave me the evidence to reclaim my life. Justice in this country isn't a gift, it is a battle of persistence and ironclad proof. I spent months as a ghost in the snow, but by refusing to break, and by using my technical skills to gather the truth, I turned the tables on a master manipulator. Today, as I sit in my own living room, the locks changed and the future wide open, I am no longer just a survivor. I am the architect of my own destiny, and the Vance legacy finally belongs to the sister who was brave enough to fight for it.